So if you spend a lot of time watching horror films, you do eventually become pretty desensitized to them. The scares become less powerful and gore almost becomes like routine. I spent a lot of my early explorations into horror trying to find the most messed up films I could find. I was really trying to push the boundaries of what I thought I could handle. Now I've been reviewing horror films for years now, so I've seen everything from, obscure underground slashers to extreme European cinema, exploitation films, found footage, new French extremity, you name it, I've seen it. But every now and then, I come across a film or somebody sends me a film that makes me question whether or not I should have watched it in the first place. Now, I have a real high tolerance for extreme cinema, but today I want to talk about 4 films so messed up I couldn't finish them and never want to watch again. So first up, I'm going to start with MDPOPE. So I was sent MDPOPE by one of my followers a while ago, and it remains to be one of the most harrowing experiences I've ever had, going into a film blind. So MDPOPE is a real infamous trilogy of films or documentaries. They were made by an anonymous editor. Nobody knows who it is, and it is essentially a compilation of real life death footage. Everything from accidents to, acts of violence, and just some of the most darkest material you could imagine sourced from the darkest corners of the internet. So the films or documentaries don't really tell a story, there are no characters, and there is no kind of analysis of what's happening at all. These films are essentially compilations of really shocking material stitched together, designed with one goal, and that goal is to be as upsetting as possible. That's the only thing I can think this was made for. Let's see how far we can push the viewer. Let's see how much our viewer can handle before they tap out. And that's exactly why I don't recommend this film to anybody. I watched the first maybe 3 minutes of this film before I realized what it was I was watching. I scrolled through the rest of the film and decided that this is not for me. Now, when people hear about these types of films, they're attracted to the reputation of this film, so they go into it trying to see for themselves whether it is as bad as everybody says it is. But the problem is that curiosity quickly gives way to something else. Unlike horror films where every gore scene or every shocking moment has been specifically designed and presented with special effects and all of that, MDPOPE is not. It is presented as real world suffering. And whether you believe these films should exist becomes the central question, right? With horror, when it feels real, we know we are participating in a carefully crafted illusion. But these films remove that safety entirely. Instead of exploring fear through storytelling, the MDPOPE films rely almost entirely on escalation. More shocking, more graphic, and more upsetting. They are interesting only as a reflection of internet shock culture and humanity's fascination with forbidden images. But the bottom line, and ultimately for me, I love horror because it is controlled fear. It isn't real, and I know that. Next up, we have 1971's Goodbye, Uncle Tom. I found this movie to be so incredibly controversial. Goodbye, Uncle Tom is this pseudo-documentary. So the film centers around these 2 documentary filmmakers who are sent back in time to a pre-Civil War American South. So its stated intention was to confront audiences with the real brutality and horrors of the slave trade. But for me, that simply is not true. This is an out-and-out exploitation film. It's horrific. Many critics have argued that this film lingers so obsessively on humiliation as well as suffering, and because of that, I feel this film crosses the line from condemnation into pure exploitation. Now, it's one thing to portray cruelty, but then there is turning cruelty into an aesthetic. And that's what this film did. Watching this film today, it feels way less like a historical drama and more like a film that was trying to push the audience and trying to see how much they can take. Now, the production of this film was enormous. You have hundreds of extras. We have these large scale period recreations, so technically it's a very ambitious film. But morally, this film is awful. There are some people who defend this film as one of the most uncompromising anti-slavery films ever made, and others find it just completely exploitative. Things happen to extras in this film who are way too young to have consented to what happens to them. And while this is a historically important subject, that subject gets pushed aside because of the poor choices the filmmakers decided to make. Even by today's standards, this is a really messed up film that shouldn't have been made this way. Next up we have Black Metal Veins. So this is an incredibly emotionally difficult film to watch. So directed by infamous filmmaker Lucifer Valentine, Black Metal Veins presents itself as this documentary who follows a series of addicts around over an extended period of time. Now, any one of Lucifer Valentine's films could have been on this list. I don't rate them as films. I think that they are just shock for shock's sake and have no real value. I do think Black Metal Veins is the best thing that he's done, but that's not saying a lot, because this documentary is still really impossible to get through because of how savage it is and how it doesn't explain anything. Unlike most conventional documentaries, there are no experts here. We have no narration or wider social analysis. Instead, we are placed beside people whose lives are collapsing in real time. So, on paper, documenting addiction isn't inherently exploitative or problematic. There are some incredible documentaries out there that focus on addiction. But the question with this film is, does this film simply document addiction, or is it profiting from it? Documentaries come with extraordinarily large responsibilities. When documenting vulnerable people, people naturally start to ask big ethical questions. Was anyone here capable of giving meaningful consent? Was there anybody here helping these people? Or was their suffering documented simply for entertainment? And unfortunately for me, that's what this film feels like. Like all of his films, they just feel incredibly problematic and exploitative. It's a film that feels completely void of hope. Everybody involved here feels like they are not moving towards recovery at all, and it's hard to watch. We are watching people trapped inside addiction with very little distance between camera and subject. It feels incredibly invasive, not to mention just the things that were shown. It's just really not something I would want to revisit. When I finished watching this, I wasn't impressed by how extreme it was. I just felt so incredibly sad. And sadness isn't necessarily a bad thing for documentaries to invoke. But this is a film that really made me question whether the cameras should have been there in the first place. And finally, we have Mondo Cane. So this is the oldest film on this list, but it's probably the most influential film on this list, if you can say that about the films I'm talking about. But without Mondo Cane, there is a very good chance that many of these later shock documentaries wouldn't exist. And I'm not saying that's a good or bad thing, I'm just saying it as a fact. Because it was released in 1962, it became the very first Mondo film, or the film that created the, Mondo genre. So instead of presenting a story, this film or documentary or shockumentary travels around the world, exploring really, unusual customs. It also shows or highlights strange traditions and shocking imagery specifically designed to provoke audiences. Now, some sequences are genuinely fascinating cultural observations, but other sequences, or most other sequences in this film, has been criticized for manipulation or selective editing, and generally just exploiting or sensationalizing really awful things. And that really is the legacy of Mondo Cane. It is constantly blurring the line between documentary and spectacle or exploitation, because you're never really entirely sure that you're learning something about another culture, or whether we are simply being encouraged to stare at something simply because it's unusual or not what people from other parts of the world are accustomed to. Now, today we are much more aware of, the ethics of documentary filmmaking. We ask, and we should be asking questions about, context or representation, editing, bias. And Mondo Cane feels way more interested in creating reactions than it is in providing understanding. It is an incredibly influential documentary, but influence doesn't necessarily mean responsibility. Watching it today feels like watching the birth of shock entertainment as a commercial product. So I can handle a lot of really disturbing content, but when that disturbing content, turns from fiction into reality, that's when I start to switch off, because I simply can't handle it. And I think that that is okay, right? I think that that's fine. There are people out there who can watch this type of stuff and get something out of it that I can't. I don't want to see real suffering. I don't want to see real people, hurt. It doesn't feel like entertainment for me. And there is one thing that connects all of the films on this list. Outside of being disturbed by just the imagery of all of these films are disturbing because they made me question whether the cameras should have been there in the first place. There is a huge difference between horror and exploitation. Horror can explore, grief, violence and human cruelty in a way that still respects the audience. And exploitation often asks a much simpler question. How far can we push this? Sometimes that does produce, important cinema. And sometimes it produces, historically important films. And sometimes it leaves you thinking how anybody thought that this needed to be made. Now, I'm not saying these films should be banned, and I'm not saying that people shouldn't watch them. Film history is full of difficult works that deserve discussion. But if somebody asks me if I would recommend any of the films I've just spoken about, I would honestly say no. Not because I think they're too disturbing, even though they are incredibly difficult to watch, but because they don't offer enough in return for what the film is asking. And for me, that's the difference between a film that is challenging and one that I just simply will never want to watch again. So if you've seen any of these films, let me know whether you agree or whether there's any other films that made you feel the same way. If you like this type of content, we're posting 2 videos like this a week here on YouTube, but you can also find me on TikTok, on Instagram, and on Facebook, where I post videos every single day. There are hundreds of horror film recommendations, documentary recommendations on all of these platforms, so if you're ever stuck with what to watch, go check out these pages. The world we live in can be really brutal, and these films kind of highlight that brutality. And that's why it's important to be good to other people, and most importantly, be good to yourself. The world doesn't have to be bad all the time. We can affect how the world is simply by smiling at other people. I'll see you next time.